students, colleagues, and members of the University of Chicago community, welcome to the first director's lecture of this academic year of the Neubauer Collegium for Culture and Society. And I would like to offer a special welcome to the students of Human Being and Citizen Corps. You are just beginning your academic careers at the University of Chicago by reading Robert Alter's translation of Genesis, a book that is itself about beginnings. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of the words you read in these weeks and some of the conversations you have with your fellow students, something a teacher says to you, will reverberate in your memories all your lives. Let me say a few words about beginnings. As many of you know, the University of Chicago is celebrating its 125th anniversary. You might say, in the beginning, the university's first president, William Rainey Harper, was a distinguished scholar and a passionate teacher of the Hebrew Bible. He was a professor of Semitic languages at Yale before coming to Chicago to help found this university. And according to our own college dean, John Boyer, who I don't know if all of you know, has just published a history of the University of Chicago, Harper, the first president, so loved ancient Hebrew syntax that is, John Boyer says, quote, his teaching focused on grammar at the expense of literary feeling, unquote. Indeed, Boyer says, quote, Harper's love of grammatical order easily spilled over into a love of organizational planning with fateful consequences for the new University of Chicago, unquote. So it's, for me, I find it a fascinating thought that the love of ancient grammatical structure might inspire him to structure one of the great modern universities. And I've wondered whether the fact that there is a core curriculum here now traces its way back to Harper's interest in the structure of the early Semitic language. Now, of course, Harper, when he read Genesis, before he read it in Hebrew, he read it in English. As a boy, his father encouraged him to read the King James Version over and over again. And it was in this immersion in this translation that opened him up onto what would become his life. Now, I think it's hard to overestimate the gift of a gifted translation. I think it's an act that is as selfless as it is creative. The translator must submit himself, herself, to a foreign and sometimes forgotten language, culture. He must submit himself to authorial voices, sometimes from long ago. And sometimes he needs to venture out to the horizon of what barely makes any sense at all and try and find a way back to bring it back to us. So he must also be in empathic relation with contemporary readers. He must intuit what is required to render these ancient insights in such a way that we can glimpse their depth while not losing sight of their distant origins. And precisely because he must write for us, for our eyes and ears, a gifted translator must realize that his best work is transitory. For we're transitory too. We shall not always be here. There will eventually be other eyes and ears that will require a new great translation. And the greatness of a great translation resides in the fact, in significant part, that it's here for us now. I think it's an act of love, both for the ancient texts that might otherwise be lost, and for the contemporary reader who would be impoverished without it. Now, in the case of translating the Hebrew Bible, which I want to emphasize is a text so important to Christianity and to Islam, as well as to Judaism, there is a special challenge. For thousands of years, untold billions of people have believed and continue to believe that the Bible is or has a divine message. And for all of us, believers and non-believers, it is important to understand what that message has been. For part of what it is to be a civilization is to be able to remember our past as a means of understanding our present and imagining our futures. And to this, I think we are indebted to the generosity and the poetic gifts and the sheer perseverance of a gifted translator. Now, tonight, we're going to be hearing from a great biblical translator from our time. And I think to understand what an extraordinary translation Robert Alter has given us, let us first take a look at the opening lines of the King James Version. That's the text that William Rainey Harper read again and again as a boy. And let us pay attention to the syntax and the structure that he loved. Quote, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Period. 3 definite articles. It's the beginning, the heaven, the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. Period. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Period. The S in the Spirit is capitalized. And God said, 'Let there be light.'" So we're in the 4th sentence before God makes his first declaration. And now compare that to Alter's translation. Quote, "When God began to create heaven and the earth then was welter and waste, and darkness over the deep, and God's breath hovering over the waters, God said, 'Let there be light.' Period." Now, I do not mean to diminish the King James Version, which has its own majesty, but it is written for a different age, and by now it comes to us with a certain formality attached to it. The King James Bible was translated for early 17th century Christian readers, and so a phrase like "without form and void," terms so familiar to ancient Greek philosophy, which in turn was so important to the early Christian fathers, would seem appropriate. By contrast, Alter gives us, "and the earth then was welter and waste." But Alter gives us more, and those of you who have started in Human Being and Citizen know this. He gives us footnotes. Students, this is my one chance to speak to Human Being and Citizen this year. I teach it many other years. But I really encourage you to read the footnotes carefully, for Alter has turned the footnote into a literary form. For example, in the first footnote, Alter explains that in the Hebrew, tohu vavohu, and I want to say, doesn't that sound wonderful? Tohu vavohu. The second word, vavohu, is just made up. It's a nonsense word to rhyme and reinforce with the first word, tohu. And I find that amazing that if you think back to the original author of this text, the original author is trying to describe a situation before creation, and to do that, he sort of uses a word that has not yet become a word. It's a lovely rhyming sound, and it only becomes a word, it really gets created as a word as it's used in this text. Now, all of this is available on the first page of Alter's translation, as is his explanation for his own choice of words. Alter explains that he uses alliteration, welter and waste, darkness over the deep, to capture this feature of the Hebrew. He also explains that the first word, tohu, quote, by itself means emptiness or futility, and in some contexts it's associated with the trackless vacancy of the desert, unquote. And again, Alter brings our own imaginings back to the mind of that original author who just might have been thinking of desert images to capture the emptiness of pre-creation. And so Robert Alter has really given us 2 great gifts. First, the gift of translation, and second, the gift of intimacy. Through the footnotes, he allows us into the inner chambers of his creativity. He explains why he made the choices he made and where his own imagination has wandered. The footnotes add an even more poetic layer to an already poetic translation. Now, Robert Alter has been recognized around the world as one of the great literary critics and translators of our time. He has taught since 1967 at the University of California, Berkeley. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, the Council of Learned Scholars, the Library of Congress, and is past president of the Association of Literary Scholars and Critics. In 2013, he received the Conference on Christianity and Literature Award for Lifetime Achievement, and he was recently inducted into the Israel Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has by now published about 24 books, but let me mention a few of my favorites. In addition to Genesis, there is the David story, a translation with commentary of 1st and 2nd Samuel, the wisdom books, Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes, and recently published Strong as Death is Love, Song of Songs, Ruth, Esther, Jonah, and Daniel. Now, each is a marvel, sometimes delightful, sometimes heartrending, always an intimate journey into the world of the Bible. So please join me in welcoming Robert Alter to the University of Chicago to speak on challenges of translating the Bible.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm very touched by that introduction. And I think if you ever tire of being a professor of philosophy and a psychoanalyst, you might consider moving into literary criticism. Also, it's a great pleasure to be here and to see a few very dear friends and all you eager undergraduates. Now, it's of course a kind of preposterous undertaking to begin a translation of a book that's been translated again and again, and that in the English language has a canonical translation. The reason, of course, that anyone would do this is that you're unsatisfied by the existing translations. And I'll start off by talking about that a little bit. Let me set the King James Version to one side. I'm going to be talking really about those various translations done by committees, ecclesiastical, academic committees in the second half of the 20th century. The King James Version is, as Jonathan said, a majestic achievement. For us, because 400 years have passed, or for many of us, it's a little problematic to read because the language is archaic. That's not the fault of the King James translators. The language has just changed a lot. I would recommend the recent Norton Critical Edition of the Old Testament, edited by my dear friend Herbert Marks, who's here with us, which does a lot in its explanatory notes, which are wonderful on other accounts, to make accessible the language of the King James Version. But there are two other problems with the King James Version. One is that it's riddled with errors. Some of them minor, some of them real howlers. And this is simply because we understand Biblical Hebrew a lot better now than it was understood in Christian Hebraist circles in the early 17th century. The other problem is that the King James Version, although it is often wonderfully eloquent, is not always eloquent. I think it does better, actually, with the prose narrative than it does with the poetry. There are wonderful lines of poetry, but then biblical poetry is terrifically compact, and that's part of its power and its beauty. And I don't think they were listening to the sound of the Hebrew when they did it. They were deciphering it from the written page. And as a result, there are many lines that are sprawl all over the place, that are arrhythmic, and so forth. Okay, enough about our 17th century predecessors. Now, the two problems with all the English translations that were done after the Second World War are an insufficient sense of the Hebrew style and an insufficient sense of English style. And I can explain that very briefly. Style is not something, if you go to Johns Hopkins, probably the University of Chicago, Yale, or Harvard, and do a PhD in biblical studies, you're going to learn all sorts of important things, and you, in some ways, will become a good philological critic of the Bible, but you're not going to hear much about style in your classes. The second problem is that in the 17th century, culture was still sufficiently unified that a person who knew all these ancient languages could also be fully abreast of the literary culture of his own time. Say Lancelot Andrewes, who was probably the most influential among the King James translators, was one of the great prose stylists of the early 20th century. And we have his sermons, and we know that. This is not true of the learned gentlemen. I don't think there were any women involved, at least not in North America, who did these translations in the second half of the 20th century. Now, I'm going to give just one example. I think it's kind of cheap and maybe not too instructive to spend a lot of time taking pot shots at the competition. But at the very beginning of Genesis, the New Jewish Publication Society translation, God is said to have created the greater light to dominate the day and the lesser light to dominate the night. Now, there are two things wrong with this. One has to do with a beautiful cadence in the Hebrew, and I'm going to come back to this phrase in a few minutes. A beautiful cadence in the Hebrew that disappears into dominate the day to dominate the night. The second thing is the diction. And this is because when you do your PhD at the University of Pennsylvania, say, in biblical studies, you're not reading poetry and you're not reading novels. That is, to dominate is a word that belongs to the realm of geopolitics or to the realm of sexual perversion, but I don't think it belongs in the creation story. So I'll come back to that phrase in a few minutes. So let me lay out a little agenda, and then I'm going to give you a few brief examples of what I've tried to do with this agenda and a few longer examples. First, there's the matter of levels of diction. That is, there is not one diction in the Hebrew Bible. Roughly speaking, I would say there are three. There's the diction of the narrative prose, which is a kind of decorous middle diction. It does not use fancy language. It's a kind of everyday language, but very eloquent. It uses a deliberately limited vocabulary. How do I know that? By the poetry. That is, there are all kinds of words in the poetry that never appear in the prose. For example, there's only one way to say light, L-I-G-H-T, in the prose narrative, and that's the word or. Whereas in poetry, you can say Ziv, Zohar, Negohot, and so on and so forth. That is, words that would correspond to brilliance, splendor, effulgence, and so forth. But you cannot do that in the limited vocabulary of the narrative. And I have tried to honor that stylistic norm. One of the consequences of that stylistic norm, and I'll give an example in a couple of minutes, is that punning and repetition are very important, and if it's possible to do it in the English, one should try to do it. But I was laying out the levels of diction. Then there's poetry. And poetry definitely is an elevated linguistic register in the Bible. It seems to be somewhat archaic. As I've said, there are poetic terms that are not used in the prose. It even has certain grammatical features which are distinctive to the poetry. And you can't quite do that in English, I think. But some slight archaizing touches in rendering the poetry, I think, are in order. And then there is the dialogue. And in the dialogue, while roughly speaking, the parties of the biblical dialogue tend to speak correct literary Hebrew. There are gestures toward the vernacular, and I will illustrate that afterwards. And I think that a translation has to try to get at those gestures of the vernacular. In fact, a large burden of biblical narrative is carried by dialogue. And I've come to see over the years, after I wrote a book on biblical narrative, that biblical dialogue really is the precursor to novelistic dialogue. You can't quite get that in the Greek epics because the characters are wonderfully eloquent, but they perform speeches rather than have the give and take of a novelistic dialogue or proto-novelistic dialogue. I do want to give one small example of repetition and why one should do it in translation in a conventionally limited vocabulary. In the story of the binding of Isaac, Genesis 22, let me back up one step. There is a very frequently used biblical word, na'ar, which means a young boy, a lad, a servant, a slave, anybody in a position of subservience to somebody else. So even a king's courtiers are called na'arim. I use the same word in all these different contexts, whereas you have what I think is the terrible decision of modern translators to use translation as a mode of explanation and to use a different term for each context. So, in the story of the binding of Isaac, there's a sentence that sounds like this in my translation. And Abraham said to his lads, "Let me and the lad go up and worship, and after we will return to you." Now, I think I'm the only translator to have replicated na'ar, na'ar. Everyone else says servants or even slaves, and then let me and the lad or me and the boy go up. I think that the repetition is very poignant. But at first he's turning to his slaves, and he says to his slaves, "We're going to go up to the mountain." And then he refers to his son, and he says, "Let me and the lad go up." So the same word with almost opposite meanings, referring to people who are his property and to the son that he loves and he thinks he's about to kill. So that's a tiny example of where it's not quite a pun, but it's certainly a kind of wordplay where I think it's important to preserve the repetition. Then there is the matter of rhythm. Now, I think all good literary prose is rhythmic. It's really the beating heart of the prose. And like a human heart, when it goes into arrhythmia, life is threatened. So, and of course, since I've been reading the Bible in Hebrew since adolescence, I hear these rhythms all the time. And it deeply disturbs me to read an English arrhythmic rendering of those wonderful sentences. So now I'm going to share with you a little discovery that I had when I first started translating Genesis. That same phrase to dominate the day and to dominate the night, when I came to it, without thinking, I translated it as follows: "And the great light for dominion of day, and the small light for dominion of night, and the stars." And then I stopped because I was a new translator. I didn't know what I was doing. And I said, why did I do that? Why did I translate dominion of? And the first reason was that it's not an infinitive limshol, but it's a verbal noun, and it's a kind of, it sounds fancier. It's memshelet. And the whole phrase in Hebrew sounds like this: Et ha'maor hagadol lememshelet hayom, v'et ha'maor hakaton lememshelet halayla, v'et ha'kochavim. And then I realized that what I had done without being conscious of it was to replicate the Hebrew cadence. And the Hebrew cadence, the P writer has a great, the priestly writer has a great sense of grandeur. The grandeur of the moment comes through the cadence, and I think you need the cadence to get it in English. Okay, finally, there is, not finally, I have a couple of other categories. The expressive syntax. Now, I think biblical syntax is, I go back to the founding father. I admire syntax and grammar too. Biblical syntax, I think, is more flexible than modern English. But there are moments, for example, that are perceptible in the Hebrew as inversions. And I'll give you just one example. When Joseph's brothers, I hope all you undergraduates have gotten that far in Genesis, come back from their first journey to Egypt, and they tell their father Jacob that Simeon has been held as a hostage, and that the man who rules over all Egypt, of course, Joseph will not see them again unless they bring down Benjamin. And what does Jacob say to them? In my translation, he says, "Me you have bereaved. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and Benjamin you would take. On me is all the burden." In the Hebrew, that sounds like this: Oti shikaltem, Yosef einenu uVinyamin einenu ve'et. Yosef einenu ve'Shimon einenu ve'et Binyamin tikachu alai hayu kulana. Now, the sentence begins this way: me, oti. This is not the normal way to say "you have bereaved me" in biblical Hebrew. What you do is you take the verb and you put an accusative suffix on it. That would come out in Hebrew as shikaltuni. But the writer of this dialogue didn't do that. He decides to break out the word me, oti, and to put it at the beginning of the sentence, to syntactically front it, as linguists say. And I think that this is expressive of Jacob's character. That is, Jacob becomes a kind of prima donna of paternal grief after he thinks Joseph is dead. So he puts himself at the front of it. He says, "Me you have bereaved, oti shikaltem." And after all, we are not totally oblivious to the possibility of syntactical inversion in English. It's not as common as it used to be. It's more common in poetry than prose, but you can make it work. And I also, while trying to make a translation readable for contemporary readers, don't want to make it sound as though the Bible were written the day before yesterday. A little bit of a slightly antique coloration, I think, is justified and maybe even needed. Okay, then there is the matter of boldness of word choice. And I would stress the following. As you all know, biblical narrative is extraordinarily economical. That is, a story that a novelist would take 600 pages to tell can be told in 10 short chapters in the Bible. This means that individual words have a saliency that they wouldn't have in a novel of 600 pages. And I'd like to give one illustration. In the story of the banishment of Hagar and Ishmael, that's the chapter before the binding of Isaac, when the water runs out and they're in the middle of the desert under the blazing sun, Hagar is convinced that her son Ishmael is going to die very soon. And so what does she do? I'm going to say the Hebrew word, vatashlech, and she does something or other under one of the bushes to Ishmael. The King James Version says thrust, which is not bad, but it's a little inaccurate. Other translations I've looked at say put, lay down, set, or something like that. But this verb, lahashlich, in biblical Hebrew means only one thing. It means to fling. It's the same verb that's used at the beginning of Exodus when Pharaoh says, every male child you shall fling into the Nile. So I think the writer is making a daring choice, that Hagar at this moment, absolutely despairing of the survival of her only son, in a paroxysm of maternal grief, flings her son down under a bush and then runs off to a distance. So I believe that translators need to match the boldness of the original writers, and these were really great writers. Okay, finally, one last comment, a generalized comment, and then I'd like to go on to a few extended examples. Biblical vocabulary, both in the prose and the poetry, is very concrete. There is a limited number of abstractions in biblical Hebrew. And so I think that words that are abstract and polysyllabic, most biblical words are rather short, and Latinate don't work very well to render a convincing representation of the Hebrew. Most of my examples are going to be from Genesis, I promise for the sake of the students, but just one short example beyond Genesis. At the beginning of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, we have a phrase that turns out to be recurrent, which is rendered in the King James Version as vanity, remember vanity of vanities, and vexation of spirit. Now, vexation of spirit is actually totally wrong. It's a misunderstanding of the Hebrew. Vanity is approximately, you understand, it's vanity as in the Latin sense of vanitas, that is, it's not a woman primping in front of a mirror, but emptiness, futility. But the Hebrew is much more concrete. The Hebrew, the first word, hevel, means breath. In other words, something that has no substance to it. And the second word, I believe, the second phrase, translated as vexation of spirit, I think means herding the wind, which is a wonderful metaphor for futility. So I translated the whole thing as mere breath and herding the wind. And I think that is much more faithful to the concreteness of the prose poetry of Kohelet. Okay, well, last generalization. This is the translator's despair. wordplay. That is, the Bible is full of wordplay, some writers more than others. And wordplay, of course, is very hard to transfer from one language to another. Jonathan Lear gave an example with a tohu vavohu, where I substituted alliteration for the rhyming of the Hebrew. I'll give. I have to confess, there are places where I throw up my hands in despair and say, there's no way to reproduce this in Hebrew. And then the last refuge of a scoundrel after patriotism is a footnote, and then I explain the wordplay in the footnote. But I'll give you one example, my very last example outside of Genesis, from Isaiah, which I recently completed in draft. Isaiah loves to take words and turn them around 180 degrees through sound play in order to illustrate or dramatize, really, the perversion of values, where light is called dark and dark is called light, that kind of thing. So there's a line in Isaiah that runs like this: and he hoped for justice, and the word for justice is mishpat. And look, blight, and the word for blight is mispach. So you have mishpat, mispach. And then the next line is, he hoped for righteousness, and the word for righteousness is staka, and look, a scream. The word for scream is tzaka. So I decided that maybe I could allow myself just a little leeway, because it seemed to me that the whole two lines were meaningless unless you made an attempt at replicating the wordplay. So I translated, and he looked for justice, he hoped for justice, and look, jaundice. And he looked for righteousness, he hoped for righteousness, and look, wretchedness. It's an approximation, but I think that approximations are often better than anything at all. Okay, I promised a few longer examples. So let me begin with two instances of dialogue. The first is from Genesis 20. It's, for those who don't remember the story, Abraham has come to the kingdom of Gerar, and there he passes Sarah off as his sister. And Abimelech, the king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. And God came to Abimelech in a night dream and said to him, "You are a dead man because of the woman you took, for she is another's wife." And the abruptness is there in the dialogue. That is, it's actually just two words, really three syllables in the Hebrew. Hincha meit, you're dead. This is a nice way to be addressed in a dream. And Abimelech had not come near her, obviously sexually. And he said to her, now here's a very strange sentence. "My Lord, will you slay a nation even if innocent?" Which sounds quite weird, but it sounds quite weird in the Hebrew. It's Hagoy gam tzadik taharog. I think that the writer contrived this sentence in order to line up this exchange between the immediately preceding episode, which was the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. That is, you recall that in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham bargained with God, and he said, will you wipe out the innocent with the wicked? And he bargained him down to 10 just men. So whether Abimelech is saying this or whether the writer is alluding to it through the strange words assigned to Abimelech, it's as though it's what is being said is, are you up to your old tricks again? Wiping out whole kingdoms. The nation, of course, is Abimelech, even if they're innocent. And did not he say to me, she is my sister? And she too said, he is my brother. There's a stammer in the Hebrew. You can see what I mean by the beginnings of novelistic dialogue in the Bible. That is, the Hebrew says, V'hi gam hi amra. And it's a stammer or splutter of indignation. Wait a minute, I didn't do anything, and the two of them just bamboozled me. And to get the liveliness of the Hebrew, I think you have to reproduce that sputter of indignation in the dialogue. Okay, now I'm going to skip down a few lines to the next morning. Abimelech summons Abraham, and he says to him, what have you done to us, and how have I offended you, that you should bring upon me and my kingdom so great an offense? Things that should not have been done, you have done to me. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what did you imagine when you did this thing? Now, there's an oddity here, which I'd like to point out. It has to do with a small but very effective narrative device in the Bible. You all probably know that there's one set way to present dialogue in the Bible. That is, X said to Y, blah, blah, blah. And Y answered and said to X, blah, blah, blah. This is a set pattern. It occurs again and again. But there's a variation, and we've just hit the variation. In the variation, an X says to Y in his speech, and then the repetition of the formula for introducing speech, and X said to Y. Now, I've collected maybe 50 examples. In just about every example, most of them quite clear-cut, when the formula for introducing speech is repeated without an intervening answer from the second party in the dialogue, it means that the second party has a problem in responding. Either he or she, usually it's he, he's embarrassed or dumbfounded or surprised or nonplussed or whatever. And so I think that's a signal to the audience. And I believe that's the case here. And finally, so Abimelech repeats his speech in a kind of summary form. What did you imagine when you did this thing? And Abraham said, for I thought, there is surely no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. And in point of fact, she is my sister, my father's daughter, though not my mother's daughter, and she became my wife. Now that in point of fact, it's omna in the Hebrew, sounds to me like a lawyerly term. That is, I don't know, there have been all kinds of explanations of what he's trying to do, but it sounds like he's splitting hairs in order to save face. And then he goes on and says, this is even more interesting, and it happened, okay, I'm about to read a translation that no one else has done, that is an English version, which happens to be the only correct one. I'll explain in a minute. And it happened when the gods made me a wanderer from my father's house that I told her, this is the kindness you can do to me in every place to which we come. Say of me, he is my brother. Now, everybody else says, when God made me a wanderer. But the Hebrew argues against that. That is, some of you may know that the common Hebrew word for God, Elohim, is anomalous. It has a masculine plural ending, but it's treated grammatically as a singular. Why this is the case, we don't know. Some people say it's a plural of majesty. I'm not entirely convinced there was a plural of majesty in biblical Hebrew, but in any case, it might have been just a linguistic fossil, where many languages have these, where it used to be the gods, Elohim, and so it became God with a capital G in English. However, when Elohim is treated grammatically, grammar remains important, as a plural, it doesn't refer to God with a capital G, it refers to the gods. That's the way it's treated in the golden calf story in Exodus, for example. And here, the verb hitu is in the plural, and I think it has to mean the gods. So what's going on here? Abe is the first monotheist. Why is he talking about the gods? I think he knows his audience. That is, he's speaking to a polytheist, and he doesn't want to confuse him with monotheistic concepts. And Elohim, in this sense, can be almost an idiom, meaning something like fate, destiny, circumstances. So that's what he says to Avimelech. So even in the choice of a single word, you can see the liveliness, almost the sociological thickness of the dialogue. I think it's one of the most wonderful things about biblical narrative. Okay, I want to give you another example. The first dialogue between Jacob and Esau. Now, I've collected a whole little package of rules of thumb about reading biblical narrative. And one of them is that the first speech of any character is a defining moment. It's an exposition of character. And I think this is true not only of Esau, but of Jacob here. So let's see how it works. Esau goes off hunting, and he's not successful that day. And Jacob prepared a stew, and Esau came from the field, and he was famished. And Esau said to Jacob, "Let me gulp down some of this red stuff, for I am famished." Now, there are two important word choices here. One has been often observed, the other not. He can't think of the ordinary Hebrew word for stew or pottage, nazid, which the narrators just used. So he points to it and he says, literally it's this red, hadom hazeh. And this enables a punning etymology by the narrator. His name is called Edom, because Edom and the Hebrew for Edom and Adom sound very close to each other. But the other word, which I've translated, "let me gulp down some of this red stuff." This is really interesting to me as a literary critic, and even as a philologist. I believe in philology. I think that biblical scholars don't know how to do it. There are two words for feeding people or for eating in biblical Hebrew. One is la'achil, that's the standard word. And then there's another word, lahavrot, which is always giving somebody food after fasting or if he's doing poorly, he or she is doing poorly. But That's not the word that's used here. This word is used only in this piece of dialogue, in the whole biblical corpus. It is a word that occurs not infrequently in Rabbinic Hebrew, which would be almost a millennium after this text. And there it means something like force-feeding animals. Now, we don't know if the word had exactly the same meaning over 1,000 years, but given the fact that it has this meaning in Rabbinic Hebrew, the Hebrew of the Mishnah and the Midrash, you can reasonably surmise that it's some kind of crude eating word. So how did it sneak into the text here? As I said before, you're only supposed to use certain words in biblical narrative and not other words. I think the writer couldn't resist it. In the midst of the liveliness of this red stuff, he decided to give Esau a very crude eating word, which you're not supposed to use in literary narrative. But then let's pay attention to Jacob's response, which is no less significant as characterization. And Jacob said, "Sell now your birthright to me." And Esau said, "Look, I'm at the point of death. Why do I need a birthright?" And then they make the deal, okay? So Jacob's response seems to be very simple. Sell now your birthright to me. But every word is carefully calculated, and the syntactic chain is very carefully arranged. He begins with sell, and then now, hayom. In other words, not tomorrow or next week. We have to strike the deal now if you want this stew. And then the object, the portentous object of the sale, your birthright, which he's been holding back till now. And then at the end, the person who was going to acquire the birthright, to me. So you see how very carefully calculated Jacob's first speech is. And he is a calculator and a bargainer. He even bargains with God. So, and this suggests that unlike the midrashic treatment of this story, the contrast between the two brothers is not a simple contrast between a good guy and a bad guy. It's a contrast between a pathetically crude, impatient guy and somebody who is very shrewd, who maybe you might not want to buy a used car from. And he behaves that way through a good part of his story. Okay, I'd like to conclude with one slightly different kind of example. I've lingered on dialogues, and dialogue is so tempting. And I'm going to call this this category the eloquence of simplicity. Here, I'll read a slightly extended passage. It's the beginning of the flood story in chapter 7. Noah was 600 years old when the flood came, water over the earth. And Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives came into the ark because of the waters of the flood. Of the clean animals and of the animals that were not clean, and of the fowl and of all that crawls upon the ground, 2 each came to Noah into the ark, male and female, as God had commanded Noah. And it happened after 7 days that the waters of the flood were over the earth. Okay, I'm going to stop on that for a minute. This is what the Hebrew says, and this is what the King James Version says, were over the earth. Almost any modern translation you look at will say something like surged over the earth, whelmed over the earth, raged over the earth, and so forth. And that's a kind of modern embellishment which does violence to the stylistic beauty of the Hebrew. The stylistic beauty inheres in the sheer simplicity of was over the earth. And we'll, let me go on, and we'll see one or two related examples. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the second day of the month, on that day, and then we have a line of poetry. How do I know it's poetry? Because it scans. That is, it has the same number of beats, accented syllables, in each half of the line, and the two halves of the line are semantically parallel. All the well springs of the great deep burst, and the casements of the heavens were opened. Well, why casements? Some people are going to be annoyed, say, we don't even know what a casement is. Well, you'll find it in your college dictionary. Come on. It's a slightly archaic word for window. Modern translations erase the window, and they say something like sluice gates, and that is a betrayal. I don't think a translator should ever substitute his or her own metaphor for the metaphor of the original. Rashi in the Middle Ages in France understood perfectly well this meant window. He said, Bela'az, that is in the foreign language, that is Old French, this is fenestra, which he does in Hebrew transliteration, which of course is modern French fenêtre. So he understood it meant window. But it's not the normal Hebrew word in the Bible for window, which is chalon, as in modern Hebrew. That is, chalon appears dozens and dozens of times in the Bible, whereas arubot, which appears here, occurs maybe 6 times. I once counted it in a concordance in the whole Bible, and all but one occurrence are in poetry. So it is poetic diction, and probably archaic. There's a word like this that appears in an earlier Semitic language, Ugaritic. So to get the, that's what I meant when I talked about poetic diction. To get something of the flavor of the poetic diction, I opted for casements instead of windows. Let me go on just for 3 or 4 minutes, and I will conclude. And the rain was over the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Again, was, instead of pelted down or whatever. That very day, Noah and Shem and Ham and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons together with them, came into the ark, they and all, they as well as beasts of each kind and cattle of each kind and each kind of crawling thing that crawls on the earth, and each kind of bird, each winged thing. They came to Noah into the ark, 2 by 2 of all flesh that has the breath of life within it. And those that came in, male and female of all flesh, they came as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. And the flood was 40 days over the earth, and the waters multiplied and bore the ark upward, and it rose above the earth. Okay, I'll stop the example there with one final comment. The waters multiplied. Now, I realize that sounds a tad strange in English. That is, you multiply numbers, you don't multiply waters. But then we have the happy precedent of the King James Version, be fruitful and multiply. And I believe that the writer chose the word multiply because he wanted us to think of the creation story. That this is a reversal of creation. God had enjoined humankind to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, and now it's the waters that are multiplying and filling the earth. The Hebrew Bible is full of echoes and allusions like that, and I think you have to be alert to them when you translate. Okay, let me conclude by saying this. I'm afraid in this exposition I have been blowing my own horn, or tooting your own horn, I guess you say. One of the dangers of translation is that you begin to forget idioms in your native language. So, perfect illustration. This may sound as though I've been tooting my own horn. I'm aware of the fact that there are plenty of imperfections in my translation, places where I just couldn't find a solution to what I saw in Hebrew, and other places in which I thought I was finding a solution, but I was probably exercising bad judgment. You don't always catch yourself. So no translation is a perfect thing, and if any translator thought that his or her translation was, that person would be laboring under delusions of grandeur. What I've tried to identify for you this evening is the sort of issues of style with which I think an adequate translation of the Bible needs to grapple. And whatever the faults, I've been trying to grapple with that for a while. And if you're enjoying what I've done, that is my recompense. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to say we have time for some questions, and I think some students from Human Being and Citizen wanted to ask some questions, and we'll start there.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Lee in Professor O'Neill's Human Beings section. And first, I'd like to say thank you, Professor Alter, today for your time. And one question I had for you was, in the beginning of Genesis, when man is first created, and there's much ambiguity with the regard of the gender of the human and God, and when God allows that the human is created by us without reference to any other creating entities, what problems did you face with the presentation of proper or adequate pronouns in the Hebrew text?
No, I'm not sure if I really followed the question, because God, you're talking about the first version of creation in Genesis 1, right?
Yes.
Well, God creates the other living creatures, and then he creates the two first humans, male and female. And that's in keeping, you might say, with a hierarchical ideology of the priestly writer that man and woman are seen as the pinnacle of creation. So I don't see where the difficulty is.
What about the first person plural?
Oh, the we you're asking about. Oh, yes. I think that this is perfectly well understood in the Middle Ages, again by Rashi, who was one of the great readers of texts of the Middle Ages, I think, in any language. He said, let us make a human in our image, etc. I'm sorry I didn't catch that. It's the acoustics were not right. So Rashi says, Nimlach bapamalyashalo. That is, he consulted his entourage. That is, Rashi understood that there was a mythological element at the background, that there's a kind of hazy group of celestial beings called elsewhere B'nai HaElohim, the sons of God, not biological sons, but and so he's speaking in the celestial court and saying, let's go ahead and make a human. I don't think that's a big problem. Thank you for the question.
Yep.
My name is Anirudh Penathur from Professor Kopp's HBC class, and I had a question. In my readings of your translation of Genesis, it seemed that God was portrayed in a nuanced human way with real human flaws. Is that the way you see it? And if not, how do you see the portrayal of God in Genesis, and how did it shape your translation?
Oh, well, what's clear is that God in Genesis is far more anthropomorphic than he ever is afterwards. So in the garden story, he goes for a walk in the evening breeze, which is what you do in a nice garden. Then he comes with two divine messengers, angels, to Abraham's tent in Genesis 18, and partakes of a meal with that Abraham has prepared. So God in the book of Genesis looks like a human being and in certain ways acts like a human being. Maybe that's because these are very old stories, first transmitted orally and then reworked in literary ways. By the time you get to Exodus, the whole ball game has changed. That is, God reveals himself to Moses from the burning bush, but he doesn't. Moses sees fire. He doesn't see God. And a little later in Exodus, when Moses says, "Show me your glory," God says, "Nothing doing. You can't see my glory. You can see my wake, like the wake of a ship, what is behind me," and he hides them in a rock and then passes over. So that's very different from the God of Genesis. But the God of Genesis is very anthropomorphic.
Thank you.
My name is Fatima Sattar, and I'm from Professor O'Neill's HBC class. And my question was, how did your previous background of religion or the religion you practiced during childhood affect the way that you translated Genesis?
Actually, in childhood proper, I didn't have much exposure to the Bible. I blush to admit in front of so large an audience that probably when I was about 10, my first exposure to the Bible was in comic book form, which that's probably happened to some of you too. So by my mid-teens, I had a pretty good knowledge of Hebrew, and I began reading the Bible in Hebrew. And I have to say this, that I'm an inveterate literary person. And the thing that hit me when I read these stories and these poems was not theological, but that they were great literature. And really, that has profoundly affected the way that I translate the Bible, that I try, as I've illustrated this evening, or attempted to illustrate, I try to convey something of the literary greatness of the Hebrew style. This does not preclude, if you had questions of theology and faith in the back of your mind in your question, it doesn't preclude accessibility, that's the wrong word. It doesn't include relevance to people whose reading of the Bible is dictated by faith. For the following reason, I can't explain why, but the people who effected the monotheistic revolution in the early centuries of the first I guess one should say the last pre-Christian millennium, many of them were great writers. And they chose to convey their religious vision in masterful prose narratives and in often brilliant poetry. not every line in every chapter. You know, there are things that are boilerplate in the Bible, but mostly it's quite remarkable. So it's my contention that if you can get closer to the literary subtlety and eloquence of the Bible, you will also get closer to the religious vision that the writers meant to convey.
My name is Isabel Martin, and I'm with Professor Moret's HBC class. And my question actually refers to the passage we were just discussing, where God says, "Let us make a human in our image," and uses a communal pronoun to link man and God. So why does this communal pronoun linking man and God only occur this once, and why does it only occur with the creation of humans?
Now, I would have to do a little fact-checking to see if it occurs only this once, so I won't... I know the Bible pretty well, but I don't want to misspeak on this. The fact that it occurs only in relation to humans has to do with the priestly writer's notion that the human being is the culmination of creation. And remember, unlike the version that we get in the next chapter, he goes on to say that you shall hold sway over all over all living creatures. So that would make logical grounds, or dramatic grounds, not logical, dramatic grounds for, at this culminating point, God turns to his assembled courtiers on high and says, "Let us make a human."
As you were talking, I was wondering about the interaction between the biblical text and the system of chanting or troping that has been sort of, put on top of it, in the ways that in different cultures, certain musical melodic lines will be used to kind of highlight different meanings of the text, particularly dramatic musical moments for kind of rare or dramatic moments in the text. So I was kind of curious about, this is sort of just a question of ignorance, to what extent has that been studied in a scholarly way, like you're presenting here, and then sort of what's your personal perspective on what those systems of chanting kind of bring to a meaning, understanding of the text?
Okay, that's an interesting question. Let me explain to the whole group that beginning around the 6th century of the Common Era and going on till the 10th, a group of grammarians in the city of Tiberias in the land of Israel kind of established a biblical text, which is the one we generally use, and there are no vowels in the ancient text, like the texts found at Qumran on the shore of the Dead Sea have no vowels. They're only consonants. So they invented a system of little dots and markings for vowels, and they also invented a set of what are called tropes for indicating how the text should be chanted. And I often look at those when I'm working with the text. That is, they're interpretive. One thing that they do is they parse the syntax. For example, there's a particular trope called etnachta, which means pause. And it generally marks the end of a clause in the middle of a verse. Once in a while, you see that they've made a mistake, that they've put the pausal mark in the wrong place. And then there are dramatic interpretations through the trope marks. My favorite one, which those of you who know these things will all remember, in the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife in Genesis 39, when she propositions him in the brutal proposition, lie with me, it's only 2 words in the Hebrew. The next word, it's 1 word in the Hebrew, is, and he refused. Now there's a very rarely used musical trope called shalshelet, which means chain. And it's a wiggly kind of thing above the word. And it's very long. It's about 3 times as long as the normal notes. So when the reader in synagogue says, and he refused, it's, and he refused, like that. These things are fun and at times they're instructive.
Hi, my name's Aryeh Bernstein. I'm just a Hyde Park guy. You spoke about 3 genres of biblical literature: narrative, poetry, and dialogue, and the unique challenges in rendering them, and your goals and guides in how to do that, and what you thought was inadequate in existing translations. I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about the 4th genre of biblical literature, law, and like what guided, if you did the entire text of the 5 books, did you have the same goals in mind when you tackled that material?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. If everyone didn't hear, now what I was referring to was levels of diction, or you call them linguistic register rather than genre, but then there is an important aspect of biblical literature that I didn't breathe a word about, and that's law. And yeah, I think that law has its own register. It's a very, very good point. There are certain grammatical constructions and formulations that speak of, let's say, case law. You know, should a man do X or Y, something else will follow. And when you translate, I think that you probably need, I've tried to anyway, make it sound decorously legalistic.
I was just curious, what is the purpose of the phrase, "and it happened that"? Why not just go right into the action of the...
Yeah, this is tricky. It's 1 word in the Hebrew. It's a conjugated form of the verb to be, vayhi. And it's kind of almost a filler, I would say, to get into the beginning of a narrative segment, so that it doesn't start abruptly. And in my very first draft of the early chapters of Genesis, I actually followed the King James Version. I said, "and it came to pass." And I showed it to my late friend Amos Funkenstein, who was a brilliant historian and knew Biblical Hebrew very well. He said, "You can't do that because it sounds just too much like the King James." So I just hit on a phrase that was a kind of filler like that, and it might not be the best solution. So I'm glad you asked that, because that's an example where I can't exactly applaud myself for what I've done. It's just a sort of compromise response.
Thank you.